"Sir, can you hold this medal? My father died for it." The autumn air at Arlington carried a clean, solemn chill, rustling flags that lined the marble walk like sentries. Inside the Veterans Hall, brass plaques glinted under soft lights, and a hush followed the echo of a finished speech. Colonel Robert Mitchell stepped down from the podium. Reporters angled microphones. Cameras clicked in bursts, while old Marines gripped his hand with quiet respect. He answered 2 questions, then spotted her by the aisle, a little girl in an oversized denim jacket, steady but nervous, clutching something against her chest like a secret. She approached with small, decisive steps and lifted her gaze. "Sir," she whispered, voice thin but unwavering, "my dad said this belongs to you." In her hands lay a weathered bronze star, ribbon frayed, its patina catching the light like a muted flame. Mitchell's poise faltered as he leaned closer to see. The medal felt heavier than any award he'd ever held. On the back, an engraving tightened his breath. Sergeant David Thompson. A name like a door unlatched, opening to heat, dust, and orders shouted over gunfire. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice gentled. "It was my dad's," the girl said, fingers trembling. "He told me to give it to the man who truly knew what it meant." From her pocket she drew a sealed envelope, inked in a familiar, careful hand. "David Thompson. What's your name?" he asked, words barely crossing air. "Lily," she said, lifting her chin a fraction. "Lily Thompson." The surname struck like a bell, ringing through corridors he'd tried to close. He accepted the medal and letter with both hands. "Thank you, Lily," he managed, the hall blurring at the edges. She nodded with the brave formality of a soldier's child, then turned and threaded back through the crowd, disappearing between uniforms and suits and cameras, leaving silence where noise had been. Mitchell stood rooted, the bronze star warming in his palm. Aides murmured about interviews. Donors hovered politely. But the present thinned until he could hear only a far-off wind and the scrape of memory across a desert road, where a young sergeant ran toward fire instead of away. He slid the envelope into his breast pocket, like contraband. The medal he cupped as if it might slip through his fingers. He drew a slow breath he did not quite finish. Then he straightened for the waiting press, a man divided and both halves newly awake. Night draped Washington in glassy reflections and long streets. From Mitchell's office the city looked orderly, distant, safe. A single lamp pooled amber light on the desk, where the bronze star lay beside the sealed letter, both objects louder than the traffic below. He had faced ambush with steadier hands than this. Yet here he was, a decorated Marine, hesitating before a paper thin as a breath. The envelope waited like judgment, patient and still, its edges worn by a dead man's care. Sergeant David Thompson arrived in memory, uninvited, a young face beneath a dusty helmet, eyes too alive. He had been loyal, fearless, and tolerant of half measures, the man who ran first when others calculated odds, the one Mitchell called reckless in neat official ink. Discipline had been Mitchell's creed and shield. Orders made sense where chaos tried to rule. He had warned Thompson that defiance kills men, that impulse and heroics burn units down. But truth has a way of surviving reprimands. He remembered their last argument before the mission. "You can't save everyone, Sergeant," Mitchell had said. "Our orders are clear." The younger man held his gaze. "Then maybe our orders are wrong." "Sir?" The sentence still lived, sharp as broken glass. Mitchell's chest tightened with something like apology, a feeling he had never written into any report. He reached for the metal and felt its history hum dust storms. Burning metal, voices over the net, and a choice that split duty from mercy. Outside, a siren wailed and faded down Constitution Avenue. Inside, he broke the seal with a careful thumb. Paper rasped, and the room seemed to lean in. His eyes traced the first line-steady handwriting, unmistakable as a signature on the heart. The words spoke of a mission of civilians pinned down, of a decision taken against the book, but for the living. They spoke without bravado, only plain conviction, as if courage were simply math done under fire, balancing lives against the weight of obedience. Mitchell swallowed, the lamp halo jittering on the page. Admiration and shame braided tight in his throat. The letter did not accuse. It invited him to see, to admit what he already suspected in silence, that some orders are safe and some are right. He set the paper down, breath leaving in a slow surrender. The office returned mahogany, glass, clean lines. But the man within it had shifted on his axis, feeling the past move like a fault beneath the city, promising aftershocks he could no longer avoid. The envelope opened with a fragile tear, as if even the paper knew the weight of what it held. Mitchell unfolded the pages with careful fingers, his breath shallow and deliberate. The handwriting was steady, unpretentious, the hand of a man who had written without drama. "Sir," it began, "I know you thought I was reckless. Maybe I was. But sometimes orders aren't enough." Mitchell leaned back in his chair, the hum of the city fading beneath the gravity of each word. The letter recounted a mission in vivid detail, one Mitchell had tried to bury deep in memory. Thompson wrote of civilians pinned down in a bombed-out village, trapped by enemy fire. Command said hold position, the letter read. But I saw children in the open. I saw mothers screaming. He described how he broke formation, rallying 2 men to flank the enemy line. It was a choice that saved dozens of lives and cost him his own. Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as he reached the final paragraphs. "I don't regret disobeying," Thompson wrote. "I regret that you never understood why I had to." The words pierced through layers of rank and regulation, cutting straight to the man beneath the uniform. "You once called me reckless. I hope one day you'll see what that recklessness saved." Mitchell read the line again and again until the ink seemed to blur. The letter closed with something unexpected, a plea, not an accusation. "If I don't make it home, please find my daughter someday. Tell her I died trying to do the right thing." Mitchell stared at those lines, his throat tight, the room suddenly too small to hold the weight of them. He pictured the little girl at the memorial, denim jacket and brave eyes. She wasn't just delivering a medal. She was delivering a message her father had trusted him to carry. Memories surged forward, breaking through walls he had built for decades. The sound of gunfire, the sharp bark of orders over the radio, the look on Thompson's face before the mission. Mitchell had filed the report, called the Move Insubordination, and moved on to the next battle. But the truth, the human truth, had been left behind in the sand. And now it sat on his desk, ink on paper, demanding to be seen. He set the letter down gently, as if it might shatter under its own weight. His metals suddenly felt hollow, their shine dulled by a story that had never been told. The walls of his office, once symbols of discipline and service, felt like a cage. What was legacy, he wondered, if it was built on half-truths and omissions? The answer pressed against him from the page. It was nothing. Mitchell walked to the window and stared out over the Capitol dome, glowing beneath the night sky. His reflection in the glass looked older, heavier, more uncertain than ever before. The letter had not just revealed Thompson's sacrifice, it had revealed Mitchell's failure. A failure not of tactics or leadership, but of understanding the heart beneath the uniform. He whispered into the darkness, "I was wrong." But guilt, once awakened, is not content to sit quietly. It gnawed at him as he turned off the lamp, the words echoing long after he left the room. He had a duty still unfinished, a promise made by another man's dying hand. And as he locked the office door behind him, one truth followed him into the cold night. This story wasn't over. Not for Thompson, not for Lily, and not for him. The road to Pennsylvania stretched beneath a gray morning sky, long and empty. Mitchell drove in silence, the letter folded carefully in his breast pocket. Every mile seemed to drag him deeper into the past he had avoided for years. The town was small, the kind of place where flags flew from every porch. It was the place Thompson had called home, and where Mitchell now sought forgiveness. Rebecca Thompson's house was modest, a white colonial with a tired porch swing. He paused at the gate, suddenly unsure of what he would say. What words could bridge the chasm between his choices and her loss? He walked the path slowly, medals tucked away, no uniform to shield him. When the door opened, a woman with weary eyes and strong shoulders stood before him. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice low, almost reverent. Her gaze hardened as she recognized the man at her door. "I know who you are," she said flatly, her hand gripping the frame. He started to explain, but she cut him off with a sharp shake of her head. "You took his honor away before the bullets ever did." The words hit harder than any enemy round he'd ever faced. "I never meant to," he murmured, his voice breaking despite himself. "But you did," she replied, tears forming but refusing to fall. "My husband died saving people, and you wrote him off as reckless." Her pain hung in the air like a flag at half-mast. Mitchell reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter, extending it gently. "He wanted you to know why," he said. "He wanted you to understand." Rebecca hesitated but refused to take the pages from his hand. "I don't need his words to know who he was," she said bitterly. "What I needed was for you to know before he died." They stood there in silence, two people bound by the same man yet separated by blame. The porch creaked under their feet as the autumn wind swept between them. "I came to say I'm sorry," Mitchell finally whispered. "For everything." Rebecca's eyes softened just slightly, the faintest crack in her armor. "Sorry doesn't bring him back," she said, and closed the door. Mitchell lingered on the porch, staring at the wood beneath his boots. No apology could undo the report he had written or the years of silence. But somewhere inside, he knew that facing her was a step he had to take. The war had ended long ago, but its consequences still lived here, in this house, in this grief, and walking away felt harder than any battlefield he had ever known. He turned back toward the quiet street, the letter still clutched in his hand. Children rode bicycles past flags fluttering on fences, and neighbors waved from porches. It was a town that still believed in heroes, the kind his report had buried. For the first time, Mitchell wondered if redemption was even possible. But deep down he knew he had to try, not for himself but for the man he failed. The small Pennsylvania house held echoes of a family now incomplete. After Rebecca's silence, Mitchell lingered in town, unsure of his next step. He saw Lily in the yard, crouched beside a swing set, her hands busy with chalk. She drew stars and stripes on the pavement, colors bright against gray stone. When she noticed him, she stood tall, as if her father's courage lived inside her. "Did you read it?" she asked, skipping past introductions or politeness. Her eyes were steady, blue like a clear autumn sky, expectant but vulnerable. Mitchell nodded, pulling the letter from his pocket, his voice low. "I did, Lily, and I understand more than I ever did before." She tilted her head, as if measuring whether he spoke truth or habit. "My dad told me stories before bed," she said, her tone proud. Stories about brave soldiers who did the right thing, even when it was hard. Her voice softened, repeating the words she knew by heart. He always ended with, "Courage is doing what's right, not what's easy." The phrase landed like a hammer on Mitchell's chest. For a moment he couldn't speak, the lump in his throat too heavy. The wind rustled the flag that hung above the porch, its fabric whispering honor. Mitchell crouched so he could look Lily in the eye, his medals absent, his armor gone. "Your father was one of the bravest men I ever knew," he admitted. "And I didn't see it until it was too late." She studied him, her small hands clasped behind her back. "You see it now, though," she said simply, without accusation. Her words were not meant to wound, only to remind him of a duty unfinished. Mitchell felt a strange warmth in that moment, undeserved but real. It was the kind of faith a child gives freely, without conditions. Rebecca watched from the window, her arms folded tight across her chest. She saw her daughter speaking with the man she despised, yet didn't intervene. Perhaps even she knew that Lily's innocence carried a truth no adult could. Mitchell rose, placing a hand gently over his heart in respect. "I'll make sure people know what he did," he promised. Lily smiled faintly, her eyes bright with unshaken pride. "Then you'll be telling the truth," she said with quiet certainty. The innocence in her words felt like judgment and grace together. Mitchell turned toward the car, the medal heavy in his pocket. Behind him, the child of a fallen soldier stood taller than he did. Back in Washington, the air buzzed with ambition and consequence. Mitchell entered his office in a granite building near Capitol Hill, where aides hurried with binders, schedules, and whispered strategy. The bronze star rested hidden in his desk drawer, a silent reminder. But politics rarely left room for ghosts or guilty conscience. Senator Caldwell arrived that afternoon, sharp suit and practiced smile. He was Mitchell's mentor, his guide through the treacherous world of campaigns. But his handshake carried warning, not encouragement. "Robert," he said firmly, "you need to let this thing go." Mitchell stiffened, already bracing for the battle beneath the words. "The past is the past," Caldwell continued, his voice smooth as glass. "Digging into old missions won't win you a Senate seat." Mitchell opened his mouth to argue, but Caldwell leaned closer. "Leave it buried, or your dreams die with it." The words dropped like chains, binding ambition to silence. Mitchell's aides chimed in nervously, echoing the senator's concern. "Sir, the press is sniffing already. Any wrong move could destroy momentum." Mitchell stared at the desk, at the drawer where the medal lay hidden. He thought of Lily's steady voice, of her father's words on the page. Duty and ambition pulled at him like opposite tides. "Isn't service about truth?" Mitchell asked finally, his voice strained. Caldwell laughed coldly, a sound meant to dismiss ideals. "Service is about survival, Robert. Truth is a luxury you can't afford." The senator's eyes were sharp, calculating, merciless. "This isn't war anymore. This is politics. And politics kills slower." The meeting ended with polite smiles that felt like daggers. Caldwell left, but his warning lingered like smoke in the air. Mitchell remained seated, staring at the Capitol dome through his window. The letter burned in his pocket, louder than the senator's threats. He knew now that ambition came at a price too high to pay. Alone again, he opened the desk drawer and touched the metal. Its cold surface steadied him more than Caldwell's words ever could. He whispered Lily's phrase under his breath, a vow to himself. "Courage is doing what's right, not what's easy." The office lights reflected off the metal like a quiet oath. Mitchell began with a phone call to an old radio operator, then another to a medic who still kept sand in his boots. He asked for facts, not favors, dates, grids, after-action notes, anything that might pierce the fog of official language. The men hesitated, then voices softened. They remembered. They spoke of a village no map bothered to name, of a kill zone stitched by overlapping arcs of fire, of civilians pinned behind a broken wall of clay. Command said hold. The medic whispered, ashamed. "Dave couldn't. We followed him anyway." Mitchell took notes in a hand suddenly less steady, every detail threading a needle through years of silence. A pattern emerged: speed, flanking, smoke, extraction, then a lullaby of chaos ending in human breath. 47 souls counted in the medic's careful memory. The A-piece -3 after-action logs painted cleaner lines, sanded edges where danger had once torn skin. Enemy contact repelled. Position maintained, they read, like a resume polished for a job interview. The truth, he saw, had been tidied into obedience. At Archives, a clerk slid a redacted packet across the desk, black bars marching like censors over living history. Mitchell signed the chain of custody with practiced ease, but his name on the line felt heavier than the folder. He carried it like a folded flag down a quiet corridor. Back in his office, he spread pages across the table, comparing testimonies to the bureaucratic hymn. The contradictions glared like flares in a night fight. Where the men recalled a breach to save civilians, the report praised a perimeter held by discipline. He found his own signature at the bottom of a memo, ink crisp, language disciplined, conclusions final. "Reckless deviation from orders," it read in his voice, the sentence that had followed Thompson into legend. Mitchell stared until the words stopped meaning anything. Memory cut in with the precision of a blade Caldwell's staffer hovering, the quiet for the unit, the caution about headlines, funding, and morale. He had believed he was shielding the living. He had also buried the dead a second time. A call from the medic arrived at dusk like penance. "Sir, I still see his face when I close my eyes," he said. The tall guy with the radio cried when the kids breathed. Silence bridged the line from past to present. Mitchell answered, "So do I. Now I'll act." He gathered the testimonies, the redactions, the letter, binding them with a clip that felt like a shackle breaking. If the ledger of his life required a correction, he would write it with the clarity war had denied, and he would sign it in a different kind of ink. The flight was long enough for second thoughts, but he carried none past the cabin door. He traveled light, a notebook, the letter, the medal, and a promise made to a girl on an autumn afternoon. The runway heat rose like memory from the tarmac. The village lay beyond a ribbon of cracked blacktop, fields stitched with sunburned grass and low stone walls. Children watched him from doorways with curious eyes, the wary kindness of people long practiced at loss. He removed his cap and greeted them with both hands open. An elder met him beside a well with a bent tin bucket. His English came halting, warmed by patient effort. "American?" the man asked, studying Mitchell's face. "From the unit with the red patches?" Mitchell nodded, his voice caught somewhere between yes and apology. They walked the narrow lanes to a shattered wall of clay, the same one the medic had described over the phone. Here, the elder said, the shooting had been loudest, and here a tall soldier had crouched to lift a child. "Kind eyes," the elder said, touching his own in tribute. A woman approached with a scarf the color of dusk, holding a dented kettle like a relic from a church. She spoke a name the translator could not catch, then pressed a hand to her chest, then to Mitchell's sleeve. Gratitude needs few words when breath was the gift. They showed him the route the Marines had taken, through a gap in a wall and over a ditch of thorn. He saw, in the geometry of alleys and angles, how a flanking move becomes a moral choice. The map folded neatly inside his heart at last. At a small schoolhouse painted the color of rain, a teacher produced a faded photograph, a Marine stooping to tie a child's shoe, grinning, helmet tilted, radio whip arcing like a question mark. Mitchell knew the posture, if not the blurred face. "Your man carried my son," the teacher said softly. "He would not let me help," he said. "Stay, stay." She mimed the motion of lifting, then running low, the body memory of rescue etched in her bones. Mitchell bowed as if before a flag at half-staff. Shame and pride mixed strangely in his chest. Two metals melted into a single, heavier alloy. He had taught men to close ranks and hold lines. Thompson had taught them when to break formation. Both lessons lived here, in living people. He set the bronze star on the schoolhouse desk, letting it catch the same light that warmed the photograph. "This belongs to him," he said, "and to you who breathe." The teacher closed his hand around the medal's edge. "So do you," she answered. "Now tell them." The call came 3 days after Mitchell returned from overseas. Rebecca's voice was cold, controlled, but no longer sharp with hatred. "There's something you should see," she said, giving him an address. He drove back to Pennsylvania beneath a gray sky that threatened rain, his heart heavy with questions that only she could answer. The door opened before he could knock, and Rebecca stepped aside. No greetings, no bitterness, only a tired resignation in her eyes. On the kitchen table lay a small wooden box, edges worn smooth. "This came in the mail 3 days before he died," she said quietly. "I've never shown it to anyone. Maybe it's time." Inside was a letter, the handwriting unmistakable, David's. Mitchell unfolded it slowly, his hands trembling as he read. "Becca," it began, "if I don't make it home, please understand why." He explained how he couldn't stand by while civilians were slaughtered, that saving them was worth disobeying any order, even his own. The letter described the chaos of that day in haunting detail. Gunfire closing in, smoke rising over the village, screams echoing through rubble. "I knew I was disobeying, but I couldn't watch those people die," he wrote. If I fall, tell Lily her father chose honor over orders. Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes, but this time she did not hide them. Mitchell's throat tightened as he read the final lines aloud. Tell her I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was trying to be a man she could be proud of. The room felt too small for the weight of those words. Rebecca pressed a hand to her face, her voice breaking at last. I hated you because I thought you let him die for nothing. She turned away, gripping the edge of the table as if to steady herself. But he made his choice, and maybe you're not the villain I wanted you to be. The silence between them was fragile, but something had shifted. Grief still lived there, but so did the faintest hint of understanding. Mitchell closed the letter, bowing his head as if before a flag. Thank you, he said softly, placing the note back in its box. Not for forgiving me, but for letting me know who he truly was. Rebecca nodded, her eyes still wet, but softer now. Just make sure the world knows it too, she whispered. And for the first time, she didn't close the door behind him. As he walked away, Mitchell felt the mission change inside him. It was no longer about guilt, reputation, or redemption. It was about telling the story of a man who did what was right, even when the world called it wrong. And that story had only just begun. The headlines hit before sunrise, splashed across every screen in the city. Decorated colonel covered up soldier's death, one screamed. Reckless command cost lives, another accused without evidence. Mitchell's phone buzzed nonstop. Reporters, donors, old comrades. The machine he had built was now turning against him. Senator Caldwell's voice was the first he heard that morning. You should have listened, the man hissed, no trace of mentorship left. You poked at old wounds, and now they're bleeding all over your career. Mitchell listened in silence, jaw clenched, heart heavy but defiant. This isn't about politics anymore, he said. It's about truth. But truth was a dangerous weapon, and Caldwell knew how to wield it. Within hours, partial mission reports were leaked, incomplete and misleading. Clips of his past speeches were spliced into sound bites that twisted his words. Political donors withdrew support, citing loss of public confidence. The campaign that once seemed inevitable now teetered on collapse. Mitchell's team panicked, urging him to deny everything and issue a statement. Say it's fabricated. Say it's taken out of context, one advisor pleaded. But denial felt like betrayal, not just of Thompson, but of himself. I won't lie to save myself, he told them. I've done enough of that already. The room fell silent, the reality of their downfall settling in. By afternoon, protesters gathered outside his office, signs waving in the wind. Some called him a liar. Others accused him of treason. But scattered among them were veterans holding up homemade banners. Truth is patriotic, honor over orders. We stand with Mitchell. The country, it seemed, was as divided as his own heart. Rebecca called that evening, her tone distant but not hostile. I saw the news, she said. They're trying to destroy you. They might succeed, he admitted. But I won't bury the truth again. There was a pause, then a sigh on the other end of the line. Then, maybe. You're doing the right thing. The Foundation board called an emergency meeting, pressure mounting to remove him. But Mitchell refused to step down, even as the walls closed in. He stared at the medal on his desk and the letter beside it. If they stripped away his titles, his ambitions, his reputation, so be it. What mattered now was that David Thompson's story was finally being told. Night fell over Washington, casting long shadows through his office window. The glow of the Capitol dome reflected in the glass, distant yet unyielding. Mitchell knew the worst was still ahead: investigations, hearings, public scorn. But he also knew something else. For the first time in years, he was on the right side of history, and he would not back down. The following week began with silence. No calls from donors, no reporters at the door. Mitchell walked through the city like a ghost, his name now a headline no one wanted to touch. But in the spaces where cameras didn't reach, something unexpected was forming. Old Marines, men who had served under his command, began calling one another. They had stories to tell, stories the world had never heard. One by one, they started coming forward. A sergeant recorded a video from his kitchen table, his uniform still neatly folded behind him. "Thompson saved those civilians," he said, eyes burning with conviction. "He didn't disobey for glory. He disobeyed to save lives." The video spread across social media like wildfire. Others followed: a medic, a radio operator, even a young private who had been new to the unit. They described the mission not as a blunder, but as an act of impossible courage. They spoke of Thompson carrying children through smoke, of Mitchell coordinating cover fire. They spoke of sacrifice, of humanity, of the difference between following orders and doing what's right. It was testimony no press release could erase. News outlets reluctantly began airing the footage, calling it a counter-narrative. But to the people who had been there, it wasn't a narrative, it was the truth. The public's anger began to fracture, suspicion giving way to curiosity. Was Thompson a rogue soldier or a forgotten hero? And was Mitchell the villain or a man finally trying to make things right? Mitchell watched the clips in his office, the weight on his chest easing just slightly. The words of his men reminded him of something he had nearly forgotten: brotherhood. They weren't defending him to save his name. They were defending the memory of one of their own. And in doing so, they were defending the ideals they had all sworn to protect. It was the kind of loyalty no campaign could ever buy. Rebecca called again, her tone softer now than ever before. "I watched those videos," she said quietly. "I didn't know they felt that way." "Neither did I," Mitchell admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Maybe he was more than just a soldier to them. Maybe he was the best of us. There was a long silence. Then Rebecca whispered, "Maybe he was." The veteran's testimony sparked something larger than Mitchell's campaign. Newspapers published op-eds questioning how many other heroes had been forgotten. Talk shows debated the meaning of duty versus obedience. And in the halls of Congress, whispers began about reforming how battlefield decisions were judged. The ripple was becoming a wave. For Mitchell, it wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about ensuring that no soldier's sacrifice was ever erased again. Thompson had saved 47 civilians, but now he was saving something else: the integrity of their legacy. Mitchell pressed a hand against the metal on his desk, grounding himself in that truth. This was the fight he was meant to fight. The noise of politics still raged around him: investigations, accusations, endless questions. But beneath that chaos, a brotherhood had closed ranks, and their voices, once scattered and forgotten, had found strength together. Mitchell knew the path ahead would still be steep and unforgiving, but for the first time he would not walk it alone. A week later, Mitchell received a letter written in a child's careful handwriting. "Dear Colonel," it read, Do you think my dad was a hero? The question stopped him cold, heavier than any headline or accusation. He didn't respond right away. He needed to say the words in person. So he drove north again, back to the small town where Lily waited. She met him outside the schoolyard, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The autumn leaves swirled around them, the air cool and crisp. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, the daughter of a fallen soldier and the man who had failed him. "Is it true?" she asked softly. "Did my dad really save those people?" Mitchell knelt to meet her eyes, his heart heavy but certain. "He was braver than I ever gave him credit for," Mitchell said, his voice trembling. "He saved lives, including mine." The words felt like a confession and a promise all at once. Lily blinked as if holding back tears, and then a small, proud smile broke through. "I always knew he was a hero," she whispered. They sat together on the school steps, and Mitchell told her everything. He spoke of the mission, the civilians, the chaos, and the choices her father made. He didn't hide his own failures, the report, the politics, the silence. "I made mistakes, Lily," he admitted, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make them right." She listened without judgment, her small hand resting gently on his. "I don't hate you," she said finally, her voice steady and sure. "You were his commander, but now, maybe you're also his friend." The simplicity of her words pierced deeper than any accusation. Mitchell nodded, humbled by a grace he knew he didn't deserve. It was forgiveness, not complete, but enough to keep moving forward. Rebecca joined them a few minutes later, standing quietly by the steps. Her eyes met Mitchell's, no longer filled with bitterness, only weary acceptance. "Thank you," she said softly, "for telling her the truth." "It's the least I could do," he replied, "and the most I should have done years ago." They stood there together, 3 lives forever changed by one man's courage. Lily reached into her backpack and pulled out the bronze star. "Maybe this isn't yours or mine," she said, holding it between them. "Maybe it belongs to both of you for everything you're doing now." Mitchell shook his head gently. "It belongs to him," he said, "and to the people he saved." The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the playground. Children's laughter echoed in the distance, free and unburdened. Mitchell felt something inside him shift, not absolution, but purpose. He had failed Thompson once, but he would not fail his memory again. And Lily, small and strong, was now part of that mission. As they said goodbye, Lily hugged him without warning, quick, fierce, and real. "Thank you," she whispered into his coat, "for telling the world who my dad was." Mitchell's eyes burned, his voice breaking as he answered. "No," he said softly. "Thank you for reminding me who I'm supposed to be." And for the first time, the future didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a promise. The ballroom of the National Veterans Gala shimmered with polished medals and polished lies. Television crews filled the aisles, waiting for a soundbite that would define the night. Senators, generals, and donors gathered beneath chandeliers, sipping wine and shaking hands. At the center of it all, Colonel Robert Mitchell stood by the stage, notes trembling in his pocket. This was supposed to be the speech that launched his Senate campaign, but the script had changed. His aides begged him one last time to reconsider. "Stick to the talking points," one whispered. "There's still time to salvage this." Caldwell's warning echoed in his ears like an order. "Leave it buried or die with it." But Mitchell knew that burying it again would kill something far more important than a career. He straightened his tie, stepped toward the podium, and left the speech folded on his seat. The room fell silent as he approached the microphone, lights searing against his eyes. For a moment he stared out at the crowd, men and women who had worn the uniform, families who had buried loved ones beneath folded flags, and children like Lily, whose lives were shaped by sacrifice they'd never witnessed. He drew a slow breath and began, voice steady but heavy with truth. "I came here tonight to talk about leadership," he said, the crowd leaning in. "But leadership is meaningless without honesty. And honesty requires me to tell you the truth." A murmur rippled through the room as cameras zoomed closer. Mitchell continued, each word measured like a final march. "I failed a man who served under my command. I failed his family. And I failed my country by hiding the truth." He spoke of Sergeant David Thompson, his courage, his defiance, his final act of sacrifice. He confessed to authoring the report that branded him reckless, to burying the mission details for the sake of reputation and politics, and to spending years convincing himself it was the right thing to do. "It wasn't," he said simply. "It was cowardice disguised as caution." The room was silent now, not hostile, not angry, just still. Mitchell's voice grew stronger, fueled by something deeper than ambition. "Thompson saved 47 lives that day, civilians, children, people who are alive because he disobeyed my order." He swallowed hard, the truth burning as it left his lips. "And instead of honoring that, I erased it. I will not erase it again." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the bronze star, holding it high for all to see. "This belongs to a hero, not a reckless soldier, not a cautionary tale, but a man who did what was right." Applause began softly, uncertainly, from a group of veterans in the back. It grew louder as others rose to their feet, clapping not for Mitchell, but for Thompson. Tears blurred Mitchell's vision, but he stood taller than he ever had before. "This is the end of my political career," he said plainly, his voice unwavering. "But some legacies aren't built in ballots. They're built in sacrifice." He stepped away from the podium, leaving the microphone humming with silence. The cameras captured not a politician's rise, but a soldier's redemption. And for the first time, Mitchell felt free. As he walked off the stage, reporters shouted questions he didn't bother to answer. He had spoken the only words that mattered. Rebecca and Lily were there, standing quietly near the exit. Rebecca's eyes met his, not with anger, but with gratitude. And Lily, clutching the folded letter in her hands, whispered, "He'd be proud." 3 weeks later, the Foundation's courtyard filled with families, veterans, and press. A new monument stood in the center, a bronze statue of a Marine carrying a child to safety. Beneath it, a plaque read, "The Sergeant David Thompson Children's Fund, in honor of courage over orders." Mitchell stood beside it, the crisp November air stinging his cheeks. Today wasn't about speeches or politics. It was about remembrance. The ceremony began with the sound of a bugle, its mournful notes sweeping over the crowd. Rebecca and Lily approached the memorial first, laying a small bouquet of white roses at its base. Rebecca's hands trembled, but her head remained high, not in bitterness, but in pride. "Thank you," she whispered as Mitchell joined them. "Not for fixing the past, but for finally seeing it clearly." Mitchell bowed his head. "I should have done this years ago." Rebecca shook her head gently. "Maybe, but you're doing it now." and that matters." Lily traced the letters of her father's name etched into the stone, her eyes bright. "He's more than a story now," she said softly. "He's part of something bigger." Her words filled Mitchell with a warmth that medals never could. Families of fallen soldiers stepped forward one by one, sharing their stories. Some were tales of heroism recognized, others of sacrifice forgotten. Each story wove into a tapestry of service, love, and loss, the true cost of freedom. Mitchell listened to every word, engraving them into his heart like new commandments. This, he realized, was the legacy worth building. Cameras captured the ceremony, but none of it felt like a performance. This was not a public relations event. It was an act of justice long overdue. A nation watched as a soldier's name, once dismissed in a report, was now carved into stone for generations to honor. The truth had finally taken root. Rebecca stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I forgive you," she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. Mitchell's breath caught, his hands trembling, as he nodded. "Thank you," he managed, the words barely escaping. It was the first time forgiveness had ever felt heavier than blame. Lily turned to Mitchell and offered the medal he had once returned. "Maybe you should keep this now," she said, smiling faintly. But Mitchell shook his head, gently closing her fingers around it. "It belongs with you," he said. "And with the story it carries." She nodded, clutching it tightly, a symbol of everything her father stood for. As the crowd began to disperse, Mitchell lingered beside the memorial. The wind stirred the flag overhead, its fabric snapping sharply in the cold. He looked up at the statue and felt peace where guilt once lived. David Thompson's story was no longer buried beneath bureaucracy. It was alive in memory and purpose, and in the promise of those who served. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the courtyard. But Mitchell didn't see darkness. He saw legacy stretching forward. A new chapter had begun, not for his career, but for his soul. And for the first time in decades, he felt like a soldier again. Not because of what he had done, but because of what he was now willing to do. The winter sun hung low over Arlington, casting long shadows across rows of white headstones. The air was still, the silence broken only by the distant sound of taps drifting from another ceremony. Mitchell walked slowly down the familiar path, his steps measured, his heart unburdened. Beside him, Rebecca held a bouquet of fresh roses, and Lily clutched a small wooden box. They had come not for closure, but for a new beginning. They stopped at a simple stone etched with a name that now meant so much more: Sergeant David Thompson. The letters were carved deep, bold against the weathered marble, no longer lost in bureaucratic ink. Lily knelt first, her breath visible in the cold, and gently brushed the snow from the ground. From the box she lifted the bronze star, the same one she once gave to Mitchell. This time she placed it carefully at the base of the headstone. "Dad," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "They finally know." The words carried on the wind, soft yet unshakable, as if the man beneath the stone could hear them. And it would continue long after he was gone. Back at Arlington, the wind carried the scent of spring through rows of headstones. Flags fluttered in the breeze, their fabric singing the anthem of a nation built on sacrifice. Mitchell visited Thompson's grave often, never with guilt, always with gratitude. "Thank you," he would whisper each time, knowing the words could never be enough. And though the stone never answered, he always felt like it heard. Mitchell felt his throat tighten, his chest heavy with emotion he no longer feared. He knelt beside Lily and touched the metal, too, fingers lingering on the cold metal. "It's right where it belongs," he said softly, "with the man who earned it." Rebecca laid the roses down gently, her breath catching as she stepped back. "He would have liked this," she murmured, her voice filled with both sadness and pride. Mitchell nodded, his gaze fixed on the words carved into stone. "Maybe he would have told me I was late," he said with a faint smile. Rebecca's eyes glistened, and for the first time they both laughed. The three of them stood together in silence, not as enemies or strangers, but as a family forged by sacrifice. The bitterness that once divided them had been replaced by something deeper, shared purpose. Mitchell no longer saw himself as the man who failed Sergeant Thompson. He saw himself as the man carrying forward what Thompson had died for, and that purpose was no longer a burden. It was a mission. Months passed, and the Thompson Promise Fund grew beyond anything Mitchell had imagined. It provided scholarships for children of fallen soldiers, therapy for families, and recognition for forgotten heroes. Each story honored was another life brought out of silence, another sacrifice remembered. And each time a family received help, Mitchell felt Thompson's presence, steady, guiding, proud. The man who once disobeyed orders was still saving lives even in death. One spring afternoon, Lily walked into the Foundation's office in a blazer 2 sizes too big. At 18, she had graduated high school with honors and was now its youngest board member. She had chosen to dedicate her life to the mission her father started, and Mitchell had continued. "Ready for your first day, Director Thompson?" Mitchell asked with a smile. She grinned back. "I've been ready my whole life." As he watched her greet families in the lobby, Mitchell felt something shift deep inside him. The ghosts that once haunted his nights no longer tormented. They walked beside him now. They were not reminders of failure, but of responsibility and redemption. The promise he made to a dying man had not only been kept, it had grown.